I don't know if the case was in your book, but there's a woman who was fired for dating someone at a competitor's firm. Right? She was working at IBM. She was dating someone at a competitor's firm, and she refused to break off that relationship. IBM fired her. Okay? Yeah. Well, this is a long time ago. I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. There was nothing in the handbook that said you'll only be fired for just cause. So that didn't apply. She didn't have any recourse here with the policy handbook. There was no collective bargaining agreement, no employment contract. There was no public policy exception that applied. And there's nothing in any statute that says you can't fire somebody for whom they date. We just don't write statutes that narrowly, except in Connecticut. I'll tell you about that in a little while. So what did she have to rely on? Well, there was this memo that went around to supervisors at IBM that said, from the CEO, that said, we're not going to be concerned about employees' private lives. Don't take that into consideration when making any employment decisions. That's all this woman had to go on, was this one memo that got sent out by the CEO one day. What did they do? They violated their own policy that wasn't even in the handbook. It was just some memo, but it created an expectation on the part of the employee. Right? And the judge said, that's not fair. It's a case out of California, so do with it what you will, but that's the kind of thing that can happen. All right, that's the contract exception to employment at will. We'll move on here. We've got a lot to cover. Public policy exception. Basic definition. What's a public policy? Or give me an example of a public policy. What do we mean by public policy? From our public policies, we derive our laws. All right, we have broad public policy to protect the environment. We have a broad public policy to eradicate race discrimination. We have broad public policy that every student should get a free public education. Right, every child should get an education. Broad public policy to protect the poor. These are our broad principles and goals in this country. And from those public policies, we write laws. All right, we write a law about race discrimination in, say, employment or accommodations or riding a bus or what have you. But it's derived from our public policies. Okay, now, what is this public policy exception to employment at will all about in light of what you just heard? Anybody make sense of what you read here? What happens in one of these cases? Yes, Sylvia?
Well, what I understood is public policy, it's like a list of different statutory statements, basically for the protection of the workers, and it could be government, it could be a public sector job. It's mainly for the protection of the workers. It's like protecting you against any kind of discrimination. By
well, if there's a specific law that says that, then we're down here in the statutory exceptions to employment at will. So it's going to be a little different from that. But public policies are found in statutes. Some of those statutes, though, may not apply to employees at all. Right? They may be written for other reasons. Okay? For example, two employees left their workplace at 5 p.m. and went to the bar right next door to their workplace. Sounds like I'm starting a joke here. I'm not. This is a true story. They sit there and they drink for, 6, 7 hours or so, and then they go back to the parking lot, and one employee is sober, the other is drunk. The sober employee says, I'm going to drive you home. The drunk employee says, no, you're not. They get into a fight. Right? They are both terminated by their employer. Right? Why? Fighting on company property. Now, the sober employee said that simply is not fair. That's not fair at all. Right? But there's no statute that says you can't fire people for fighting. Of course you can fire people for fighting. There was no contract exception to employment at will that applied. How would this public policy exception apply here? What does this mean? Natalia?
Letting him drive, otherwise people will...
Okay, do we have a public policy that is offended somehow by that employer's action? Do we have a public policy to keep our roads safe, to keep them clear from drunk drivers? Yeah, we do. And we could cite various laws and what happens to you if, in fact, you're found driving drunk, you go to jail, you get this kind of fine, and so on. We have a public policy to discourage drunk driving. What was this employee doing? He was trying to discourage drunk driving. If an employer is allowed to fire you when you're advancing some sort of public policy, well, that's not good for our nation as a whole. And therefore, we're not going to permit it. Or so some judges have said. There are public policy exceptions in about 40 states. And they're broad and they're narrow. It depends on the state. But if you offend some sort of public policy with your employment action, then the courts are not going to permit it. The classic case is jury duty. Can you fire somebody for having to serve jury duty? Before there were any statutes in this area, could you fire somebody because they said, look, I have to serve jury duty? Well, I need you to be here, but I have to serve jury duty. It's my public obligation. Right? What can the employer do? Well, if there's no statute or court case that protects you, you're an employee at will. The employer can do whatever the employer wants to do. Employees in that situation argued that a public policy was being violated. We have a policy to promptly seat juries. It's important. Right? Our whole legal system depends on it. So if an employer is allowed to fire people or discourage them from serving jury duty, well, that undermines a public policy. That should not be permissible, and courts have agreed. Right? So that became a public policy exception to employment at will. It's now a statutory exception because we've written specific statutes, but still, originally it was simply a judge's decision that opened the door to that employee right. Yes, Dan?
Is there a list somewhere of these public policies, or are these just
I can give you categories.
Ideas?
Public policies vary from state to state. So it's hard to tell you all the public policies. But if you can find a broad principle or goal that has been violated by your employer's action, right? You were fired because you reported your employer for dumping toxic waste into the river. Right? You're a whistleblower. Well, we want to encourage that sort of thing in our public policy and in our laws, but there may be no specific employment law that applies to you. So, in some states, that's going to violate a public policy, firing somebody who does that, who reports their employer. In other states, it will not. A woman was fired for volunteering at an AIDS clinic on weekends. The employer said, don't do that. This was back in the 1980s when we knew a lot less about AIDS. Don't do that. I don't want to get infected. I don't want my family infected. I don't want my coworkers or customers infected. If you continue to do that on the weekends, you're going to be fired. All right? And she continued to do that, and in fact, he fired her. All right? No contract exception, no statutory exception. Was some public policy offended by the employer's action? What do you think? Do we have a public policy that people should be able to volunteer at AIDS clinics or generally clinics for the disabled, the handicapped? One could make that argument. But this was the state of Texas. And in the state of Texas, they did not recognize that as a legitimate public policy. If this were the state of New York or the state of California or some more pro-employee state, you'd have a different decision. All right? So public policies in one state are not necessarily the same as public policies in other states. So that's what really makes this kind of messy here. So you need to stay on top of state law as a manager. All right, contract exception to employment at will and public policy exception to employment at will. All right, any other questions about that? By the way, that employee in the drunk driving case, he didn't win. The court turned down his request to get his job back. Because in that state, it was Illinois, I think, they said that's not a legitimate enough public policy. It has not really been offended by what the employer did here. You were fired for fighting on company property. Forget the reason that you were fighting. You were fired for fighting on company property. That was the court's decision. So it's not only going to depend on the state. It's not only going to depend on the circumstances. It's going to depend on the values of the particular judge or jury. It's going to depend on the skill of counsel. It's going to depend on the credibility of your witnesses. There are a lot of variables here. You want to stay out of court, folks. All right? This is why employers go way to the conservative side in what they do, and maybe too pro-employees sometimes, because they're just concerned about this legal dimension and the price that they're going to pay. Even if they win in court, they're concerned about that. Any of you who have been through a lawsuit, you know how disruptive it is. You know how expensive it is. All right. Those are a couple of the common law exceptions to employment at will. There's more to this than what we're letting on here, but still, that's sufficient for this course at least. Any questions about these common law exceptions? No? Reasonably clear? Maybe. Maybe you're just ready to move on. I don't know. Well, let's move to the statutory exceptions then. If you're hiring somebody to be your assistant, what are you going to look for? Well, a lot of things. You're going to look for the person to be brilliant. You're going to look for a good fit. You're going to look for knowledge, skills, abilities, personality. We're going to talk a lot about this next week when we get into building a competitive workforce. But generally, you know the list of things that you would look for and ask about in a job interview. Right? Or you could come up with a nice long list. What kinds of things can't you consider when hiring somebody? What kinds of things can't you ask about? Todd?
Handicap.
You can't consider handicap. All right, we'll jot some of these down. Disability. What else? I'm sorry?
Marital status.
That's the first thing you want to ask, isn't it? Who said that? Jonathan. Very first thing you want to know about this female applicant across from you. Are you married? But you know you can't ask it, so you'll look to the hand, right? What else can't you consider?
Age.
Okay, yeah, you have a bunch of them. Age, race, religion, national origin. What else? We said before, union status. Anything else?
It's religious.
Their residence? Where you live? I don't like people from Chesapeake. Okay, yeah, we have. I listed a whole bunch of them. Okay, gender. We're at Regent here. We don't use that word. Oakland. I'm sorry, pregnancy? John?
They affiliate themselves with certain organizations.
Okay, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Or are you part of the Fraternal Order of Moose or things like that? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe. Let's say social groups. Can you ask somebody, do you listen to that Rush Limbaugh guy every day? Well, I don't know if you can ask that question. We'll get to that in a second. Robin?
Maybe thinking, I think maybe you can ask this on application, but like an interview, and you can't ask if they've been arrested or have any convictions.
Arrest, conviction record. Someone said sexual preference. Whether they're a smoker, smoking habits. Okay, medical records, disability. All right, their general health. Sylvia?
What about cultural stuff? You know, what times? Let's say we've got an international applicant, and you're a U.S. employer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, talking about their cultural opinions about how they want to approach the job or what type of culture they are from.
Mm-hmm.
That could be very like an encroachment upon.
Well, yeah, national origin may cover that. Ethnic origin or national origin in Title VII. Eunice? Maybe their financial history. Mike, you had your hand up? No? You all were going to say financial history, huh? You finance whizzes in here. All right, I mean, we got a good long list. Where do these come from? Are these from some judge-made law? No, most of this stuff that we have up here on the board it's from statutes, right? Title VII covers race, religion, national origin, and gender. Cannot discriminate on any of those grounds in any employment decision, whether it's hiring or firing or compensation or training or scheduling or anything else. All right, we have, age discrimination, union discrimination, disability. We've touched on those things. Pregnancy comes under sex discrimination. Marital status. This is one of those areas that's not covered by federal law. Can you refuse to hire somebody because she's divorced or because she's single or something like that? Unless there's a state law that says otherwise, you could take that into consideration. All right, and in fact, some Christian schools have fired people because they've gotten divorced. Right? Is that legal? Independent of whether that's Christian, for a second. Is that legal? Well, it is if there's no law that covers it. And about 25 states have marital status discrimination laws. Okay? Other things. Social groups. Most of the time you could consider this. There are very few laws that say anything about that. So most of the time it's legal to ask people about their affiliations. Okay? If you're linking it to any of these unlawful categories, then that would be a problem. But typically you can ask about this. Typically you can ask about arrest record. In some states you can't ask about conviction record. Actually, it's the other way around, excuse me. In some states you can't ask about arrest record, but you can consider their conviction record, right? A child molester who wants to drive a school bus. We have a legitimate interest in knowing what their conviction record is. I'm serious. But there are some states, I think Wisconsin is one of these states, that says you can't consider their conviction record unless it's directly applicable to the job, as in this previous example. But there might be others, if he's applying to work at Kmart or something, then you can't consider that he served time and so on. All right, so it's going to depend on the state. There are, I think right now, 11 states and maybe 175 cities that say you cannot discriminate based on sexual preference, gays, lesbians, bisexual, etc. All right, there's no federal law that covers them. There almost was. There's a movement continually in Congress to add this exception to Title VII. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, it came within 2 votes of passing the Senate. Right? It would never pass the House right now, but it came within 2 votes of passing the Senate. We almost added sexual preference to Title VII, then it would have covered employers everywhere. Right? But right now it's just a state exception. Smoking, about 21 states say you can't consider that.
Is it legal for the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service to ask the foreign visa applicants whether they are a member of terrorist organization?
The INS can pretty much do whatever it wants about something like that. Now, is it legal for you as the employer to ask? What do you think? Well, there's nothing in the law that says otherwise. But if you think you're really measuring something with that question, come back next week and we'll talk about validly measuring things in a job interview. Yes, Todd?
Well, that's a good question. Does U.S. employment law cover people that aren't U.S. citizens?
Okay, so, yeah, citizenship. Can you consider citizenship? No. You can only consider whether they are eligible to work in the United States. If you don't hire somebody because they're not a United States citizen, you violated something called the Immigration Reform and Control Act 1986. All right? So, yeah, good point. Yes, Bill?
Exceptions.
Sure. There are.
Our company I work for is a defense we're a private company. We're a defense contractor, but you are required to. Yeah. For example, if you're a convict, they won't hire you. You have to be a naturalized citizen.
Yeah, where there are safety-sensitive things and U.S. security concerns, there are going to be exceptions to all of what we're talking about here. Okay. Generally, this stuff comes from statutory exceptions down here, not up here with common law exceptions. Okay. Let me get into, just very quickly, with Virginia, our state law says you can't consider race, color, religion, national origin, sex, pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. That's interesting. Can't consider whether they've had kids or they're going to have kids. Marital status or disability. Back in Connecticut, where I came from, there's a state law that says you can't consider the method of birth control they use. Don't ask about that in the interview, folks. I know that's at the top of your list of things to ask about. We've actually written a law in Connecticut that says it's illegal to consider that in hiring somebody or firing somebody, and there must have been some sort of case that came down the pike and we had to address it, and we did it with the statute. Very pro-employee state. Okay, so pay attention to state law. All right, questions about anything so far? Let me move through this a little quicker. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, very important law. Right, as we've said, it covers race, sex, religion, national origin. Employers of 15 or more employees, excuse my shorthand here, ERS is employers, EES is employees. You'll see that through the rest of the semester. Employers of 15 or more employees are covered by this law. If you have fewer than 15 employees, this law does not apply to you. That doesn't mean if you have 12 employees that you can make decisions based on race. As we've said, there are state laws that cover smaller employers. All right, but that's the way this particular law is written. It also applies to union hiring halls. It applies to employment agencies. This is enforced by something called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Federal agency, has regional offices throughout the country. There are state counterparts to that. I think in Virginia, I'm still kind of new here, but I think it's called the Virginia Council on Human Rights. It's the first place you would go as an employee. My rights have been violated under Title VII or under the Virginia Human Rights Act, which is a parallel to Title VII. Okay? And they will handle your case. They will investigate your case and talk to your employer, and they will, free of charge, take the case to court if, in fact, they find it meritorious 5 years later. Talk about that in a little while. Two general kinds of discrimination that I want to discuss here under Title VII. And you read about these in the book, but I think they need to be unpacked a little more. There's disparate treatment and disparate or adverse impact. Okay. Let me try to illustrate this rather than just give you definitions. Let's see. Jen, you come to me, you want a job as a firefighter. This is why you got your MBA. It's been your lifelong ambition to be a firefighter. You want to work for the city of Virginia Beach. And you sit down in the interview chair and I say, Miss Jen, nice resume. Very nice. Can you tell me why you want to be a fireman?
My uncle was, and my father was, and it's been the dream for my entire life.
Your uncle was a fireman. And your father was a fireman. Why would someone like you want to be a fireman?
I want to be a fire person. No,
a fire person. Hey, get this, Mikey. Jen over here wants to be a fire person. What do you think of that? Why would you want to be a fireman? What's that?
It's not going to carry me out of a burning building.
I'm not really sure that you're cut out to be a fireman. However, we do have some dispatcher jobs that you might be qualified for. And in fact, I don't even know if there are any openings. So we'll get back to you. Doesn't get the job. She thinks that she didn't get the job because she's female. Right? What kind of discrimination are we talking about here? Discrimination that might violate Title VII and the state counterpart to that. But is it disparate treatment or disparate impact? Well, I've listed them this way so you have a hint. Right? Disparate treatment is what she would allege here. She's been treated differently, and disparate just means different. She's been treated differently because of her protected group status, because she's female in this case. Right? Same thing if Adam wants to fulfill his lifelong ambition of working on the Weather Channel. Right? I mean, could you see Adam doing that? Over here, and he'd be over here, and, repeat after me. 5-day planner and local forecast after this.
There's a cold front moving in from the west.
He's a natural. He goes and he interviews for the job, and he actually does the bid up there on stage, and he doesn't get the job. It goes to a black woman. He's offended by that. He saw her interview, and it wasn't that good. And he thinks that he was discriminated against because of both his gender and his race. He would be alleging disparate treatment discrimination, treated differently because of his protected group status, being male, being white. Who ultimately has the burden to prove something here in a disparate treatment case? Does the employee or the applicant have to prove that the employer discriminated, or does the employer, you, the manager, have to prove that you did not discriminate? What's the structure of the law here? What do you think? The employer, employee? I'm getting both answers. That's good. Somebody's going to learn something here. In a disparate treatment case, ultimately the employee has the burden of proof, or the applicant in this case. Jen has to prove that the city, in this case the fire company, discriminated against her because of her gender. All right? You have to prove the employee or applicant has the burden of proof, and here you have to prove intent. And this is very important. You have to prove intentional discrimination. Jen has to prove that not only did I discriminate against her because of her gender, I intended to do that. That was my goal here. That was what was motivating the decision. Adam has to prove that the Weather Channel didn't hire him because of his race and or his sex. All right? How do you do that? Jen, how are you going to prove that I discriminated against you because of your gender?
Well, it would be your word against mine, but I guess things like the comments that you made, like, why do you want to be a fireman? And
hey, that's just the way I talk. I'm sorry if I'm not politically
to
correct.
Mikey,
you know?
or whoever you referred to.
What's that?
I guess the comments you made to the other guy that was in the room about it, or
I said that, yeah.
Me the dispatcher job.
What other? Wait a minute. First of all, what other guy in the room? There was no other guy in the room. Were you in the room?
I don't remember being in the room.
Well, there's nobody in the room.
So it's your word against mine.
Okay, how do you prove, first of all, that I didn't want to hire you because of your gender, and second of all, that I intended to discriminate against you, particularly? The point is, it's a hard thing to do. All right, John?
Could you possibly, the candidate that gets hired, look at their credentials and compare
You would want to look
against
at that.
yours? And
Okay, the person who got hired had lesser credentials. Now, what have you proven?
that you're more qualified than they.
Okay, what have you proven with respect to this case, though? Have you proven that I intended to discriminate against you because of your protected group status?
You've proven bias, but you can't narrow it down.
You haven't even proven bias, have you? You've just proven, if you will, that the person who got the job was a little less qualified, or maybe a lot less qualified. But maybe I'm just a bad manager, right? There's no law against bad management, as we well know. You haven't proven intent to discriminate because of sex. Eunice?
Well, you have to look at the hiring history. You stated that there was no position at this time. So you look at the hiring history within that month, or within the postings. You need to look at what job descriptions were available, and then.
Sure, we're going to look at a whole bunch of circumstances here. We're going to look at the composition of the employer's workforce. All these things we want to look at, but does it prove intent, or do we just have an inference of discrimination? That's what these cases come down to a lot of times. Todd?
I was curious, if a person along the same line said that you're great for the position, but you're overqualified, so maybe you'd like the other position, but really, the other position never materializes, and you just walk out the door, and that happens on a repeated basis. Is that the exact same thing? That seems
It's the same kind of perhaps suspicious thing, but as far as proving that you didn't get the job because of your protected group status, it's hard to do. It's really hard to do. You got to get Mikey up there on the witness stand to blow it, basically. You got to get him up there to admit that his boss, in fact, is a real sexist, and he has said in meetings repeatedly that no woman was ever going to work for him, and so on. All right, it's these kinds of things, and it's hard to do. All right, so we've set the standard very high. We've raised the bar very high for plaintiffs here to prove that they've been discriminated against because of their protected group status. Sylvia?
The defense of the anti-discrimination law is one of them, like Title VII.
This comes under
NLRA.
Title VII. You're alleging that Title VII has been violated, and the specific type of discrimination we're calling disparate treatment. The two theories of discrimination under Title VII and some of these other laws as well. Okay, so yeah, that's what they're alleging. However, they're going to have a tough time proving it.
This ends Side 2.